Hey, author, want to get your latest title published as an audiobook on Audible, Amazon, and iTunes? You can do it. Just reach out to podcastandradio.com.
Welcome to Literary Latte, the podcast with a Southern accent on writing. I'm Lynda Bouchard, and I just might have the best gig in the world. I read books for a living. And there are so many times I've finished reading one that I wish the author were a friend and I could call them and talk with them about their books. Well, my guest today is that wish come true because Patti Callahan Henry and I have been crossing paths at literary festivals and conferences for many years. And the storytelling in her fiction has always resonated with me. So I'm thrilled to have the chance to talk with her today about her newly released work titled Becoming Mrs. Lewis. I've found that, much like readers, authors don't always stick to a single genre. The siren call of a particular person from history can inspire anyone, including Patti, who is a New York Times bestselling author with a dozen novels already under her belt. Patti has written her first work of historical fiction, inspired by the life of Joy Davidman, who is known, if she's known at all, as the wife of C.S. Lewis, the author and Christian apologist, who is best known for his classic children's series, The Chronicles of Narnia. Their marriage was immortalized in the film Shadowlands and in Lewis's memoir, A Grief Observed. Now, through extraordinary research and interviews, Patti brings Joy Davidman, Gresham Lewis to the page in the fullness that she so deserves. Patti, welcome, my friend, and thank you for taking time from your tour to join me today.
Oh, hi, Lynda. It is so good to talk to you. You know, I love talking to you, and you know, I love talking about this book.
Oh gosh, it's just so beautifully written. And I've got to tell you, Patti, that it was like an emotional roller coaster. I cried so much during it. It just resonated so much with me. And there are so many layers to becoming Mrs. Lewis, and I hope we get to them all. But one of them is that you grew up as a preacher's daughter. So you were probably always surrounded by stories, either from the Bible or sermons that your father gave. So did this spark your interest in telling the story of Joy Davidman?
You know, it must have, because my dad's library was full of C.S. Lewis books, and I read them from a very young age. I read the Screw Tape Letters probably when I was way too young to have read the Screw Tape Letters. If anybody knows anything about the Screw Tape Letters, I imagine Satan was hot on my tail for quite some time. So I was enthralled by him. So it would be natural that as I grew older and started writing books about the vagaries of love and improbable love stories, which many of my novels are about, that this, one of the greatest improbable love stories of all time, would enchant me, that I would want to understand it. So, you know, I can't draw a direct line to anything that happened being a preacher's kid that would, you know, take me directly to Joy Davidman, other than all the reading that I did because it was available to me and I was a bookworm nerd.
Right. And so what drew you to this story and why the shift from writing contemporary fiction to historical fiction? And also, how was that process different for you compared to the writing of your other books?
You know, I don't think I've ever once thought, I am this genre. You know, I am this kind of writer. When I first started writing, I was mostly unaware that genres were a thing, right? You know, I read in every genre and I didn't limit myself But as time went on, and as you know, I have 12 other novels that are contemporary, I did start to feel like I was boxed into a genre. Um, that my readers and my publisher expected something very specific from me. And so my writing began to shift, and I began to feel blocked and stuck because as artists and writers, you know this, Lynda, if we feel like we're only fulfilling other people's expectations, our writing or our art becomes quite stale because we're doing it as a people pleasing thing instead of as an artistic, creative endeavor. And the minute I felt that way, I stopped and said, what am I doing? And I was talking to a historical author friend of mine, Ariel Lawhon, and I said, I really want to write this historical fiction book, but I don't write historical fiction. She goes, what does that even mean? Right? That's ridiculous. And she asked me what it was about, and I told her, I said, it's about Joy Davidman. And she said, who's that? And I said, that's the problem. Let's stop talking about the wife of, because it's the wife of C.S. Lewis, but her name should be on everybody's lips. And she kind of got this look and she said, if you don't write that, I am. I said, no, I've got this. I'm totally doing this. So I don't know why I thought that I had to be stuck in a box that way. But the minute that I said it out loud was the minute I started writing it. And the process was, you asked me how the process was different for me. And, all of my novels are women's journeys, and all of my novels, like I said, are about the vagaries of love. So in that way, it wasn't different. What was different in this was, of course, the intense amount of research, because I was approaching an icon. Now, peripherally, because the novel is told from Joy Davidman's point of view, but I wanted and needed to get the facts right. Of course, certain things had to be imagined. There was not a stenographer following them around during their conversations. And their letters to each other have been lost. Hundreds, if not thousands, of their letters have been saved, but not to each other. So there was so much imagination, just like my other novels, but the skeleton of the story had to be solid and true. And that was the biggest difference.
Right. And that the research, as you said, for the setting is so important because you're writing about a specific time period, so it has to be accurate. And then there's the added challenge of bringing the past to life. So the point of view was interesting to me, and I wonder if it's typical in historical fiction or just to this book for you, in that it's in the first person, which lends a great intimacy to it. But you wrote from the first person point of view rather than the broader third person. Is that typical for historical fiction?
No, I mean, I think, nothing's really typical for historical fiction other than it's historical. But I went back and forth about whether to write this in the first or third person. And my novels are written in both. A couple of my novels are in the first person, and a few of them are in the third person. But because I made a very conscious decision to tell this story from behind Joy's eyes, to tell this story from her point of view, to tell this story in what I call the key of empathy, I didn't any longer want to hear what people said about her. I wanted to hear from her. And to do that, I needed to write this in the first person.
Well, it does lend that intimacy, and it also offers the imaginative space to create perhaps a more inclusive version of their story.
Yes, and that was part of the goal, was that I think we sometimes, especially when we talk about the wife of someone famous like this, or just the wife of anyone, when we get turned into the wife of, you take away some individuality, and that's easier because then we can put a woman in a box. But it's harder to look at the complicated woman that Joy Davidman was. And she was very complicated. When I first started researching her, I found two completely divergent points of view. There were the people who kind of made her out to be this, assertive New York woman who asserted herself into Lewis's life. And then there was the point of view of the charming, intellectual, audacious woman who charmed C.S. Lewis, the woman who he said was one of the only people who was ever able to match him wit for wit, intellect to intellect. And I wanted to know which one she was. Which was this? Who was this woman? She couldn't be both of them, but she could be both of them. So I didn't want to hear anybody's opinion anymore. Like I said, I wanted to hear from her.
That's beautiful. I just love that because you can't get bogged down in those other voices come in. So right.
Exactly. I only wanted hers. And I did that, Lynda, by reading. I mean, she was a prolific poet, a prolific author. She wrote essays. She was a critic for other movies and novels. She was a screenwriter. She was an essayist. She was an award-winning, won the Yale Younger Poets Award. So, and most of her letters, not all, most of them are published, and the unpublished ones are stored at the Wade Center and Wheaton College. And I went and read them all. So there was more than enough for me to read in her voice. I didn't have to imagine what she thought because she told us what she thought. There's published letters, there's published poems, there's love sonnets she wrote to C.S. Lewis, there's letters she wrote during the years that she knew him and met him and traveled to meet him. So it took a long while. I had to really, dive in the deep end of her voice. So the research was a lot about getting rid of my voice and writing from hers.
And was it fun for you? Because I imagine, because I love research so much, I would love that research because you are kind of like a detective. And I just love the way you share her sonnets and her stories and little vignettes at the beginning of each chapter. And it sort of gives a sense of what her journey was like just from those poems. And I think what you brought out, Patti, in the book, Becoming Mrs. Lewis, was that she had a complex life even before she met C.S. Lewis. And I just love the way the power of the written word brought them together and was the catalyst to their relationship because they began writing letters. And those letters strengthened the bond.
I talk a lot about in my other novels and in speeches about the power of words. My children used to make fun of me when they were young because I used to always say, be careful what you say, words have power. And now they repeat it back to me. So they made fun of me and now they agree with me. But that's how children go. But anyway, they first started getting to know one another through letters. Joy Davidman wrote to C.S. Lewis. She was married at the time, married with 2 young sons. And she had a mystical experience she didn't understand. And she wanted to write to someone she thought could explain it to her. And she had read C.S. Lewis's work. At this point, he had not published Narnia. He had been writing it, but he hadn't published it yet. But he had published Mere Christianity, The Great Divorce, The Screwtape Letters, and he'd been on the cover of Time magazine, and there had been an article about him in the Atlantic Monthly. So she turned to him for answers, and they got to know each other by talking about the big questions in life, the things that matter, and what a wonderful way to get to know someone is through words and ideas and literature and the big questions of life. So yes, their letters, almost 3 years, they were pen pals before they met face to face. Lewis called her his pen friend that they had. Yes, they had a pen friendship. And in that they came to know one another before they ever met face to face.
And that's a beautiful, beautiful story that you bring out just so clearly, and that she was ahead of her time in so many ways, Patti, especially her independence and courage, as you say, to save her own life by leaving a relationship with her husband at the time and her journey to discover a new life, both inwardly and outwardly.
I always say that, Joy passed away long before our beloved Mary Oliver, who wrote the poem, The Journey. And in that poem, she says, to save the only life you can save, or she saved the only life she could save. And I feel that was Joy. And I feel that watching her do that is a metaphor for all of us, not just women, but right now, yes, for a lot of women, in that, we might not need to do what Joy did and pack up our sons and move to England, which is what she did. I'm not going to give away much more in the novel, but we might, as women and men, need to pack up other people's expectations and other people's demands of us. And that is part of what she did and part of what she showed us. And her writings, showed that out
Indeed,
too.
it did. And so, what did you find the most challenging and exciting about the research for this book? And well, I know you were researching about Joy, but what did you also learn, probably that you didn't learn or know before about C.S. Lewis?
Oh, wow. So much. We'd have to have a whole nother podcast on that.
Okay.
But I'm kidding. But not kidding, but kidding. One of the biggest things I learned about C.S. Lewis was, or not learned, but I was able to take him off his pedestal and see him as a man who had a very wounded past. He lost his mother at a young age, went to horrific boarding schools, was tortured as a child at these boarding schools, was wounded in the war, lived with an alcoholic brother that he deeply loved. They had a very close bond. And I learned, we always hear about the laud praise of C.S. Lewis, but he was twice turned down for promotions at Magdalen College at Oxford. He was not as revered in his day as he is now. He was human. He was a man. He was the tutor of English literature. He didn't know he would become C.S. Lewis, right? A man who was on everybody's tongue, a man who probably is one of the most recognizable names in the world. He didn't know that. And it was amazing to see him as a man struggling with life, struggling with love, trying to decide what was right and what was wrong, trying to weigh his logic, intellect, and heart and virtues. He was at heart a medievalist. So he abided by his virtues, and to fall in love with a divorced woman seemed against his virtues. And, the things I learned about her were 100-fold. I had always kind of seen her as the dying wife of C.S. Lewis instead of the brilliant novelist and poet that she was. And she also had a very complicated and troubled past. She was the daughter of Middle European immigrants and grew up in what is called the Jewish ghetto of New York City in the Bronx. And her home was harsh, and assimilation and acceptance were the gods to which they had to bow. And she didn't grow up with a very loving and supportive home, and she had a very abusive and philandering husband who was also a good man. So nothing was black and white. It was very complicated. And I learned so much about her past, about her writings. And one of the biggest things that has happened in the last 4 years in understanding their story is that about 4 years ago, 5 years ago now, I think, a box of letters and love sonnets were found in her best friend's closet in Oxford, England. And in that box were 45 love sonnets that she wrote to C.S. Lewis, or dedicated. Some of them had been written before she met him, but she had ordered them and dedicated them to him. And that shed a lot of light on their relationship. So I learned a lot about her in that time. Yes. Isn't
That was
crazy?
so fortuitous.
I
You're so
know. It was all the timing was right for this novel. People have asked if I wish I would have written it earlier, or if I wish I had done this at a different time. And the answer is absolutely not. I believe in timing, correct timing, divine timing, whatever you want to call it. And what we know now and what we can read now about her, we didn't know even 5 years ago.
So thank you for that. And I think from reading your work, I had this idea while I was reading it, and I thought every work of historical fiction is really doubly historical because it reflects both the time in which it was written and the time in which it was set. So
Yes,
you had
yes.
to, it's a kind of a fine and tricky balancing act.
Yeah, I mean, I think the balancing act had a lot more to do for me with knowing what to put in the book and what to keep out. Because this could have been a trilogy. I mean, she is so interesting and has had such a varied life that there's so much I wanted to include and did. There's a lot on the
Mhm.
cutting room floor. And I couldn't include it, I decided in the end, if it didn't affect their love story. So that in the end was the bottom line. Did what I was writing about and the scene I was writing affect their improbable love story and her transformational journey? And if it didn't, it had to go. And as a writer, that is so painful.
It
Oh,
is, it
but
is.
yes,
It's like, as Stephen King says, killing your darlings. Oh,
it's
um,
so true and so
right.
hard. I don't know why. It's a shocker every single
It
time I
never
have to
gets
do it.
easier, but it's so necessary for the distillation of the writing and what you want to get across. And Patti, I would love for you to read a passage from Becoming Mrs. Lewis so the readers can hear your beautiful prose.
Oh, okay. I can definitely do that. So, the prologue of the novel is from Joy's point of view, of course, and it is when she is 11 years old in the year 1926. And she is sneaking out in the middle of the night with her
Mhm.
little brother, which she used to do all the time. And they're in the Bronx of New York, and they would sneak out in the middle of the night to go to the Bronx Zoo. And so the prologue it begins with this line: from the very beginning, it was the great lion who brought us together. I see that now. The fierce and tender beast drew us to each other, slowly, inexorably, across time, beyond an ocean, and against the obdurate bulwarks of our lives. He wouldn't make it easy for us. That's not his way. And then at the end of the prologue, we see them walking to the lion's den in the middle of the night. And Joy says, the pair of Barbary lions ambled forward, placing their great paws on the earth, muscles dangerous and rippling beneath their fur as they approached the bars. A great grace surrounded them, as if they had come to understand their fate and accept it with roaring dignity. Their manes were deep and tangled as a forest. I fell into the endless universe of their large amber eyes, as they allowed, even invited, me to reach through the iron and wind my fingers into their fur. They'd been tamed beyond their wild nature, and I felt a kinship with them that caused a trembling in my chest. They indulged me with a return gaze, their warm weight pressed into my palm, and I knew that capture had damaged their souls. I'm sorry, I whispered every time. We were meant to be free.
Mm, that's beautiful. A- And
Thank
it
you.
speaks to her yearnings and longings.
Yes. And when I say, sometimes as authors, this, we write something and we don't fully know what it means until later. And we were meant to be free doesn't just mean, getting out of the
Right.
bars of a cage. It can also mean free of psychological bonds or lies or relationships or circumstances. And so that theme follows through the entire
And
book.
as you said, the process of writing is always a process of self-discovery. So, Patti, what did
Mm.
you learn about your own writing, and how did it change, if at all, researching and writing this book?
I think I don't know how it changed. I think that's the kind of answer only someone who has read my other work could tell us. It's very hard to know what the difference in yourself. It's so
Mm,
subjective. But I can tell you that this was a much longer process. And so in that process, my voice was slowly weeded out and her voice could rise. I don't think there's any way not to have some of me in there because I'm
mhm,
writing it. I often say my books are never about me, but they're
mm,
from me. But this book seems to be mostly from Joy. And I wanted it that way. So that's what feels different.
Right. And she is such a fascinating and complex character. And as is C.S. Lewis, and I think that she was probably his intellectual equal, and possibly more so. She might have been more well read than he was. I don't know, but he was isolated, kind of on a pinnacle of his own intellectual abilities. And and I think he
Hmm.
found in Joy someone who was equally isolated, and they became like intellectual sparring partners. And somebody,
Yes.
they struck a chord. He was, he could talk with her on that same level. Through my reading of C.S. Lewis, even the members of the Inklings, which was a very intellectual group at Oxford, were not up to his level where Joy seemed to be. Did you find that in the research?
I think his inklings were up to his
Mm,
level. I think that they all had their own special kind of gift that they brought to the inklings. Some people were stronger in fairy tales, some people were stronger in critics, but they didn't always just talk about writing. They talked about theology,
mhm,
philosophy. They never talked about politics. But when he met Joy, he says, yes, that it was one of the first times he found, he called it iron on
mm,
iron, which is of course from the
mm,
Bible, but wit for wit,
mhm,
match for match. And that he in one of his letters, he described her mind as lithe, um,
mm,
as a tiger, and that sometimes he couldn't keep up with her mind. And so yes, their initial attraction was definitely based on an intellectual understanding. They were both sight
mm,
memorizers. They could memorize entire passages of books. They both had read the same books growing up. In some ways, she was more well read
mhm,
than he was because she had read the American literature. They both had read George
mhm,
MacDonald. They both had read the fairy tales. They both had been immersed in the same literature. So they had this common ground, although they had never met until they were
mhm.
older. So yeah, they were able to match minds on every level because they had also been immersed in the same kind of literature and reading. And both, you know, I would use the word obsessed with writing and reading. So yeah,
Wow,
I
that's
think
so
you're right.
rare. If only all of us could find someone like that.
Right, right. I mean, and that's why this love story is so
Mhm,
enriching because
mhm,
they should have never
mhm.
met. Here are these people so perfectly matched and yet so imperfectly matched, right? They obviously from the minute they started writing to each other knew that they were going to be deep friends, and yet there's no way they should have ever met. And that's fascinating.
Right, and that's the beauty of it too, and the takeaway, because she took that leap of faith and wrote to him when she had these spiritual questions, about her journey, and they sort of went through that together, but that leap of faith and the day before the internet and, all this that makes us so easily connected now, this
I wouldn't we love to have a pile of
Mhm.
letters? I mean, my lord.
Absolutely. I'll take that any day
Yep.
over.
I know. Let's write each other a letter.
Well, handwriting is so emotional, especially after someone passes away. I'm sure you know this, Patty, that the handwriting is just so emotional and it's just, wrought with all sorts of backstory that only you know. So that's powerful.
It is. It is. It's why we save cards. It's why we tie things together with a piece of string.
Mhm.
It's important. It's important.
It
Yeah.
sure is. Well, Patty, as we close, what insights or advice would you give to someone who's thinking about writing a historical novel or maybe their first work of fiction?
I would say don't be scared of the labels of it all. It's a story. It's not, contemporary, historical, science fiction. It's a story. If you start to weigh yourself down with labels and genres and get yourself all worked up about whether I'm worthy of a certain genre, you'll make yourself crazy. You sit down, you put your butt in the chair, you try to silence the voices, and you write. One of my favorite books about this is The War of Art by Stephen Pressfield.
Mm.
He talks much about resistance, and getting yourself wrapped up into what genre it is just another form of resistance and another way to keep you from sitting down and telling your story.
That's wonderful advice, Patti. Becoming Mrs. Lewis is published by Thomas Nelson Press, an imprint of HarperCollins, and is a book everyone will benefit from reading. I highly recommend it. I'll have more information about Patti Callahan, along with a link to her upcoming events in the show notes. And you can always find it on my website, bookingauthorsinc.com. Patti, I have so enjoyed this. Thank you for writing such a beautiful book and for our time together.
Lynda, it's always so much fun talking to you, and I could talk about joy all day. So this was fun for me. So I appreciate the chance to help spread the word.
You're welcome back anytime.
Okay, Lynda, thank you.
You've been listening to Literary Latte with Lynda Bouchard. For more information, visit bookingauthorsinc.com.